Undercover CEO walks in his own general store, stops cold when he hears what the employee says. The undercover CEO walked into his own store and with just one overheard sentence, saw 15 years of trust unravel in an instant. The bell above the door gave a soft chime. Ethan Carter, the undercover CEO, froze right at the threshold, feeling as though he had just stepped into a place completely foreign. 15 years building this from a humble corner shop into a thriving general store chain. And yet today, he was just a 50-year-old man wearing a faded hoodie with frayed shoulders, scuffed sneakers, and a baseball cap pulled low enough to shadow the eyes once well known in the world of business. The familiar scent of freshly roasted coffee and citrus from the fruit stand was still there, but somehow, everything seemed to have lost its warmth. The morning sunlight streamed through the large front windows, drawing long, quiet streaks across the polished floor. Everything looked fine on the surface, fully stocked shelves, a few wandering customers, employees smiling the usual practice smiles. But with the instincts of a man who had battled through half a lifetime in business, Ethan knew something was being carefully hidden behind this flawless facade. Last night he'd pored over every financial report. Sales were stable, some even slightly up. And yet, the profits had been steadily falling, like coins slipping quietly through his fingers while no one seemed to notice. "It's just a tough market, Mr. Carter." The smooth explanation from his senior management echoed in his mind. But no, Ethan Carter wasn't the kind of man to accept such easy answers. And that's why, this morning, instead of sitting behind his office door with a fine espresso and a stack of financials highlighting bolded profit margins, Ethan stood right here as a stranger in the very creation he had poured his life into. Walking along the aisles, his hand absent-mindedly brushed over the shelves. In a place once filled with dreams and relentless hard work, now lingered only unanswered doubts. A young boy darted past, his bright chatter blending with the clatter of a shopping cart over the tile floor. Ethan instinctively lowered his gaze. Avoiding the eyes of the woman beside him, it was Mrs. Thompson, a loyal customer for over 10 years. But she passed right by, not even recognizing the man who once handed out free cookie platters to the neighborhood during the holidays. He tightened his grip on the hem of his hoodie. Perhaps, just like this store gleaming on the outside and well-organized, something much darker had been festering unseen beneath the surface. And he, of all people, had been the last to realize it. Ethan's steps finally came to a halt at the checkout counter. As if on cue, a single comment floated through the air like the final reveal of a hidden curtain he'd been struggling to lift. "Just keep doing what we always do. Who's going to check this stuff anyway? Old man Carter's too busy counting his money." The employee's chuckle slipped out like a knife sharp, casual, and utterly cold. Ethan Carter, the undercover CEO, stood there, a draft of icy wind slipping through the not fully closed door. And in that moment, he knew this morning wasn't just a routine check-in. It would be the start of the biggest confrontation in his entire career, and maybe in his whole life. Ethan Carter quietly edged closer to the checkout area, his stiff hand flipping through the pages of a magazine, a clumsy excuse for lingering. Through the gaps above the gum rack, he could clearly see Miketh, a veteran employee he had once trusted, implicitly leaning low over the register screen, his fingers dancing across the touchscreen with a suspiciously practiced speed. Across the counter stood none other than Danny Martineza, longtime customer Ethan still remembered well. Danny was the kind who always managed to sweet-talk his way into priority treatment during last year's stock shortages. "So, I'm getting the special today, right, Mike?" Danny smirked, pushing a cart loaded with premium goods toward the counter. Mike glanced quickly at the screen, his eyes darting like lightning toward the overhead cameras, before lowering his voice, but not enough to escape the ears of the man hidden behind the magazine rack. "Of course, my friend. Special rate for those who know how things work. These official items? At regular system prices, who could even afford them?" "But hey," Mike chuckled softly, his fingers swiping rapidly across the POS screen. The total flashed briefly, then vanished as if it had never been there. "For a guy like you, let's just call it $78. Ethan froze. He had caught a fleeting glimpse of the original total over $120. Mike's movements were nothing short of magic, erasing every trace of the transaction in just a few taps. And then it came, that line. A blade of cold steel driven straight into the heart of the man who had built this place from nothing. "Old man Carter's too busy counting his profits in the office to ever notice." Soft laughter followed. Danny patted Mike on the shoulder like they just closed $1 million deal. Ethan stood motionless behind the display, his chest tightening. Old Man Carter, that was him. The same man who once carried crates through this very store, who had built these shelves with his own calloused hands. And now, in the eyes of those who had once benefited from his kindness, he had become nothing more than a fading name on the payroll. Worse yet, through their exchanged glances and subtle smiles, Ethan suddenly understood this wasn't an impulsive act. This was a well-oiled underground system. It had its own rules, its own players, and most dangerously, its own unspoken code of silence. "Just tell your sister to swing by Tuesday or Thursday," Mike added, leaning closer as if he were sharing a state secret. "Camera over aisle 3's been acting up the last few days. No one's watching over there." And in that exact moment, every unanswered question in those financial reports slashed through his illusions like a razor-sharp blade. This wasn't a glitch in the system, it was the system. He didn't need to hear another word. In his heart, he already knew he wasn't dealing with a few opportunists. This was a deeply rooted network, operating under his very nose, organized, coordinated, and above all, invisible. Behind the shadow of his old worn cap, Ethan Carter's eyes turned ice cold. Tomorrow, he would return not as a mere bystander, but as the undercover CEO, the one who would expose every shadowy corner of the very place he had built with his own sweat and faith. The soft light of late morning streamed through the dusty glass panes, casting pale streaks across the tiled floor styles, long overdue for replacement. Ethan Carter stood silently behind the shelves, his heart still pounding from the chilling conversation he had just overheard. But the instincts of a CEO who had weathered countless storms refused to let him walk away. He needed to know, how deep did this underground network run, and who was truly behind it all? Quietly and carefully, Ethan moved between the shelves, his eyes scanning every cash register, every cluster of employees. In less than 30 minutes, as if a stage curtain had been drawn back, the entire hidden system unfolded before him. Each familiar employee had their own set of regulars, and when those people arrived, the checkout transactions suddenly became unnaturally swift. The totals on the screens disappeared with a single touch. High-end items, imported coffee, organic meats, luxury household goods were all given special discounts at prices the system never recorded. And then, like a flawlessly rehearsed play, the perfect cover-up began. Items missing from receipts were immediately logged under damaged goods. Import. Inventory adjustment reports were signed off without hesitation. Losses were seamlessly absorbed by carefully calculated stock discrepancies. Security cameras? Ethan glanced upward. Just as Mike had said, the camera covering aisle 3 was repeatedly flagged as signal lost. Even more alarming, the system's error logs matched exactly with the peak hours when those regular customers made their visits. Returning to the customer service area, what Ethan saw next made it impossible for him to stay still any longer. Sarah, the woman he had once entrusted everything to, even calling her his right hand, stood whispering with Jake, a newly hired employee who had barely been there a week. Sarah's eyes gleamed with calculation as she occasionally gestured toward the checkout counters and merchandise areas. Jake, young and clearly unaware of the company's true values, nodded eagerly, his face lit with excitement as if he'd just been handed a treasure map leading to the shortcut for surviving in this store. Ethan held his breath. Everything was crystal clear now. Sarah wasn't just involved. She was the ringleader, the architect behind this entire system of fraud. And worse, she was actively training and recruiting new hires to keep the cycle of corruption alive. That very morning, Ethan witnessed firsthand. Sarah personally signed off on damaged goods reports without any physical verification. Jake was assigned to inventory control, a critical position never given to new hires unless for a very specific reason. Camera maintenance request forms were constantly submitted, always targeting the areas most vulnerable to fraud. The entire grim picture of a system corroding the very company he had poured his heart and soul into now stood bare before his eyes, impossible to ignore. And in that moment, Ethan Carter understood. As the undercover CEO, he couldn't simply punish a few individuals. He had to uproot this rot from the very foundation, even if it meant tearing down what was old and decayed to rebuild everything from scratch, starting with the people and the core values they had so utterly abandoned. His fingers tightened around the small, leather-bound notebook he always carried, the pressure from his nails leaving deep impressions along the soft edges. His heart ached not just from betrayal, but from the chilling realization that a familiar, creeping force had infiltrated this space, a dark undercurrent of power, orchestrated and managed with the precision of a full-fledged underground organization. Ethan kept watching in silence. At the back storage area, Julie, the warehouse supervisor, was busy filling out inventory sheets for damaged goods to be disposed of. But Ethan noticed her eyes kept darting nervously toward the corner camera. Just like clockwork, after a quick glance around, Julie slipped a small folded note from her apron, tucked it between the inventory sheets, and briskly exited the area. Ethan quietly followed her. She stopped at the employee break room location where, per company policy, no record-keeping or administrative actions were permitted. And there, Sarah was already waiting. It wasn't casual conversation. Sarah took the folder, flipped through it rapidly, then pulled out a single page, calmly shredded it into small pieces, and dropped them into a disposable coffee cup. Without a second thought, she poured in hot water, raising a crucial piece of evidence right before everyone's eyes, yet unnoticed by all. Just then, Jake appeared. "You're handling inventory today?" Sarah asked. Her voice so low, only those who needed to hear would hear. Jake nodded, clearly tense and unsure. "Just do exactly as I showed you yesterday. Everything that needs adjustments has already been marked by Julie." 7. Sarah flashed a knowing smile and pulled out a small, neatly prepared list pre-approved optimized figures. "And remember, aisle 5's camera is down. If there's anything that needs off-the-record adjustments, today's your perfect window." Ethan felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Every step, every word, every action was choreographed with chilling precision. Sarah wasn't just recruiting new employees. He controlled the entire information flow within the store. All underground transactions took place at the blind spots where cameras weren't operational. High-value goods were always assigned product codes that made it easy to record them as damaged a single click, and the items vanished from inventory. Every special discount transaction perfectly coincided with moments the cameras were down and stock audit sheets were altered. And worse, Sarah was the one managing the maintenance schedule for the system. She personally arranged for these technical errors to align perfectly with the peak operation times of the underground network. Just minutes ago, an email had been sent from Sarah's own account to the security camera maintenance provider. The content was chillingly brief. "Keep the previous schedule. Maintain current status until the end of this quarter. Any adjustments will come directly from me, Sarah." The more Ethan read, the more his insides burned. It was now crystal clear. Sarah wasn't just a cog in the wheel. She was the orchestrator, the queenpin running this entire underground operation. And perhaps even more dangerous, there might be external forces backing her. Ethan stood silently under the dust-covered ceiling camera, its fake, active red light blinking with deceptive regularity. He whispered, whether to himself or to the hidden powers lurking in that very room. Even he wasn't sure. "The game's over, Sarah. But this time, I'm the one rewriting the rules." That morning, Ethan Carter didn't walk in disguised in his worn-out hoodie. He entered his own store with the poise and authority that had once built an empire. Navy blue suit, perfectly knotted tie, and in his hand the old but commanding leather briefcase. His face bore none of the softness from casual visits in years past. Today, it was the steely expression of a founder betrayed and ready to burn the entire rotten structure down to its foundation if he had to. At exactly 8 a.m., the store's entry bell chimed, but this time, no one dared look up to greet him. The air inside was colder than the winter winds creeping in through the door. Through the store's intercom, his voice cut sharp and unwavering. "Immediate notice. All morning shift personnel to the conference room in 15 minutes. That includes Sarah, Mike, Tom, Julie, and Jake." In the familiar conference room, once filled with the laughter of year-end parties and sentimental talks about the Carter family values, the atmosphere today felt suffocating, heavy enough to crush every excuse before it was even spoken. Ethan stood before the presentation board, calmly opening his leather case. Inside was a thick dossier-reach page sharper than a blade. And then, methodically, he began presenting the evidence. Evidence of fraudulent transactions. Invoices, special pricing sheets absent from the system, all printed with user IDs. All trails led directly to Sarah, Mike, Tom, and Julie. Camera data extraction. Though most recordings were deleted, the tech team successfully restored critical footage clearly capturing Mike manipulating the system, Sarah secretly approving falsified inventory reports, and Tom physically loading goods into his personal vehicle after shifts. Falsified inventory reports. High-value items systematically logged as damaged, with quantities exactly matching missing stock recorded in inventory audits. The conference room fell into complete silence. Only the rhythmic sound of paper turning echoed each sheet, a damning piece of irrefutable evidence. Jake, you're new here. You made mistakes due to inexperience and being misled. You're suspended for 2 weeks and will undergo mandatory retraining. This is your final chance to prove your integrity. Julie, you're a longtime employee. You knew the rules but chose to stay silent. 1 month suspension. After that, you'll be directly responsible for rebuilding the inventory and internal controls. This is your chance to redeem yourself through action. Mike and Tom. Ethan paused, his eyes cold and sharp as steel. You didn't just break company rules, you systematically betrayed the trust placed in you. Immediate termination. All confirmed damages will be deducted from your final paycheck. You will hand over all company property and leave in an orderly manner. Sarah. Ethan stepped forward, placed a red envelope stamped, legal proceedings initiated directly in front of her. Sarah, you didn't just betray me, you betrayed the core values we built together. As a leader, you should have protected this system, not become the one who corrupted it. I am pursuing criminal charges. This is no longer an internal matter you will answer to the law. Sarah burst into tears, but this time, no apology was enough to mend the trust she'd shattered. Ethan turned to the room. We will not just tighten controls to prevent wrongdoing. We will rebuild a transparent, just environment where human values come first. If anyone wants to leave, the door is open. If you want to stay, prove it through your actions, not hollow promises. Ender. The room remained silent, a heavy tension gripping every face present. A new chapter had begun. It built on old lessons, but on the justice and discipline that Ethan Carter, the Undercover CEO, had just reinstated. At exactly 8 a.m., the first light of dawn poured through the large window, cutting directly across the room, thick with tension. Ethan Carter, the Undercover CEO, stood there, no longer weighed down by the dusty old coat, but dressed sharply in a tailored suit, a navy blue tie tightened perfectly, his cold gaze scanning every once familiar face. The dark leather briefcase snapped open. Each file was laid on the table like cold, heavy stones. No one could even manage a greeting. The only sound was the heavy, uneven breathing of those who now understood their time of reckoning had arrived. For the past 15 years, I've called you family, Ethan began, his voice deep and resounding like a death knell. And today I stand here, asking myself, what's left of this family besides bleeding numbers and broken trust? Before anyone could react, he opened each folder in turn. 3 months ago, on the 3rd, 28 transactions were processed using a special discount code. Who performed them? Mike employee ID number 042. Let's take a look at the screen. Ethan pressed the remote. The big screen lit up. Footage recovered from the security system played clearly. Mike was seen furtively operating the register, glancing around before typing in non-existent discount codes. Mike sat hunched, his fingers gripping the edge of his chair until his knuckles turned white. Julie, you signed off on a report declaring 124 cases of grade A coffee as damaged stock. But unfortunately, I have evidence that those goods left the warehouse through the back door and went straight into Tom's vehicle. Tom shot to his feet, his chair crashing into the wall with a piercing clang. But under Ethan's cold, piercing stare, he slowly sat back down, eyes darting, unable to utter a word of denial. Ethan placed a USB drive and a stack of internal emails on the table. Sarah, do you have any explanation for these requests to delete footage and reschedule maintenance on the security system precisely on Tuesdays and Thursdays? Sarah swallowed hard, her face pale. In that moment, the woman Ethan once trusted most looked unbearably small and pitiful. Then, the audio recording played. Old man Carter won't notice. Mike's contemptuous voice echoed through the room, a cruel reminder of the disdain behind his betrayal. Ethan took a step forward, his gaze sweeping over each face, stripping away every mask. Jake, the young man's face was drenched in sweat, his lips pressed so tight they bled. Jake, you were led astray, but I see regret in your eyes. 2 weeks suspension, you'll retake the corporate values training and ask yourself, next time, whose side will you stand on? Julie, you knew everything from the beginning, but chose silence. 1 month suspension. You will personally lead the restoration of the inventory control system if you still have the integrity to make things right. Mike, Tom. Ethan stood tall, his voice low, but every word struck like a hammer. You exploited my trust, the trust of our customers, and turned this place into a black market hidden beneath the facade of loyalty. You're both fired immediately. The door is open. Walk through it and carry the shame of this moment for the rest of your lives. Odin. Mike threw his employee badge onto the table, his bloodshot eyes glaring at Ethan before silently turning away. Tom simply gave a small nod, said nothing, his shoulders sagging like an old man, and he trudged out of the room, heavy with shame. Sarah. Ethan quietly took out a thick envelope and slammed it down in front of her. This is no longer an internal matter, Sarah. I've filed criminal charges. The law will teach you the true cost of betrayal. The one. Sarah burst into tears, but Ethan didn't flinch. Tears now won't buy back the trust you've destroyed. Ethan took a deep breath, his gaze now shifting to the remaining employees. I don't want to hear promises. From today on, every commitment must be written in actions. We will start over every inventory report, every transaction, every greeting to a customer. He slowly walked toward the window, where sunlight shone brightly on the newly restored store sign. Family is not a place where we take advantage of one another. Family is where people stand up to protect what's right when mistakes are made. If you want to leave, the door is open. But if you choose to stay, roll up your sleeves. We begin again today. His eyes softened, but his voice still carried absolute authority. The old days are over. This is a new era, one built on honesty and honor. A soft April breeze passed over the store's polished sign, gleaming under the clear blue sky. General Store was no longer the name customers whispered about with suspicion. Under the decisive and heartfelt leadership of Ethan Carter, the Undercover CEO, this place was blooming again, like a barren field awakening after the spring rains. Just 3 days after that historic meeting, the technical team arrived and dismantled the old, tarnished security cameras. In their place, a state-of-the-art AI surveillance system was installed, capable of analyzing behaviors and detecting irregular transactions in real time. There were no more blind spots for misconduct to hide. System permissions were tightened. Every transaction, big or small now, required approval from authorized management. People like Sarah, who once easily erased their tracks, would never have that opportunity again. Ethan personally approved the new internal control regulations. There would be no more special exceptions, only transparency and accountability. Ethan sat quietly in the conference room, his eyes slowly scanning through each applicant's file. He was no longer just searching for long lists of achievements on resumes, but focusing instead on the personal stories behind every new face. When a young woman came in for an interview and openly admitted she had turned down a higher-paying job because the environment there wasn't clean, Ethan simply smiled and nodded. That was exactly the kind of person he was looking for. I can teach skills, he told the HR department bluntly, but I can't teach honesty. From now on, hire people who bring their self-respect through those doors. The small signs hung in every corner of the store were now replaced with fresh ones. Fraud doesn't just steal money, it steals the future. Do the right thing, even when no one is watching. Training sessions were no longer just a series of dull slides. Ethan demanded the introduction of honest dialogues, sessions where anyone could share and offer feedback about the workplace culture without fear of being judged. It was there that Jake, the young man who once cried in the meeting room, bravely stood up, bowed his head, and apologized to the entire team. And it was also Jake who proposed the idea of creating the Guardians of Values, group exemplary employees who voluntarily monitored and reminded their colleagues of daily ethical standards. Juliet, one who had once stayed silent in the face of wrongdoing, now became the right hand of the internal audit department. She personally reviewed every pending transaction, working tirelessly day and night to restore the control system, as if it were her way of atoning for her past mistakes. In the first 3 months, the financial reports printed out caused no small amount of concern. Profits clearly declined. Those artificial profits generated by fraudulent activities were gone. But Ethan just smiled and patiently waited. By the 6th month, the numbers began to speak for themselves. Revenue started to recover. Customers returned not because of under-the-table discounts, but because they felt the respect, fairness, and transparency in every product they bought. One October morning, as the golden sunlight streamed over the display racks near the entrance, Ethan watched as Jake guided a new employee, The young man said something that left Ethan speechless. "Here, we don't just teach you how to sell. We teach you how to keep your honor." "No." Ethan slowly nodded, gently straightening the newly installed sign, "General Store, where trust always comes first." Under the maple trees at the store entrance, Ethan Carter quietly leaned against the old wooden doorframe, the coffee in his hand long gone cold, but he didn't bother to change it. Because for the first time in many months, what was warming his heart wasn't the coffee, it was hope. Just 6 months ago, Jake was that timid young man, head bowed and crying in the meeting room. Now, he stood tall by the bread shelves, his uniform buttoned neatly and his new name badge gleaming. Jake, head of transparent transactions. Every morning, before the store opened, Jake gathered the staff by a corner of the store, where a new sign now proudly hung. "Fraud might buy you a few meals, but integrity will sustain you for a lifetime." Jake held in his hand the commitment journal, an initiative he had started himself. Every new employee was invited to write in it, not a promise to the store, but a promise to themselves. And during shift changes, Jake never hesitated to recount his own mistakes, but his face no longer bowed in shamite, now shone with the confidence of someone who had truly understood the meaning of self-worth. "I used to think giving discounts to a few acquaintances wouldn't hurt anyone, but then I realized I had sold my own honor for a few handshakes. Don't be like the man I was back then. Let your integrity define your value." Each time Jake finished speaking, Ethan would stand quietly in the back, his heart swelling with so much pride that he had to clench his fists just to hold back his tears. In the second-floor office, once piled high with falsified inventory documents, now stood the trust control room, a name Julie herself had proposed. Every morning, Julie and her team carefully reviewed each transaction. On the wall, she hung a large board with the words, "No data point is just a number. Every transaction tells a story, and that story must be clean." One time, a new employee asked why Julie always spent time at each counter observing transactions when she could simply review the reports. Julie just smiled and replied, "Because some truths you can only read in people's eyes." It was Julie who discovered a new employee attempting fraud during their first month on the job. But instead of immediately imposing disciplinary action, she invited that person to her office, set down a hot cup of tea, and told the story of how she had once stayed silent in the face of wrongdoing. She ended with a line that Ethan later insisted should be engraved on the main meeting room wall. "People don't fear punishment. What they fear most is standing in front of a mirror and not being able to meet their own eyes." And in the early days after the reform, just as Ethan had predicted, revenues plummeted. The performance dashboard flashed bright red, no longer decorated with the beautiful but hollow numbers of the past. Many customers, once accustomed to those under-the-table privileges, turned their backs and left. But then, something miraculous happened. On a rainy afternoon, a middle-aged woman returned to the store, holding the hand of her young grandchild. In her hand was an old letter, a thank you note that Ethan had personally written to loyal customers during the very first days the store opened. "We didn't come back because of low prices," she said, "but because this place taught my grandchild to cherish every penny he spends." And from that moment on, more customers returned not for promotions, but because trust had found its way back onto every receipt, in every smile at the checkout counters. Ethan stood gazing at the brightly lit sign against the night sky, "General Store, where trust comes first." Beside him, Jake politely bowed to a departing customer. Julie carefully folded the day's reports with steady hands. Ethan took a deep breath, and as the door to those dark days quietly closed behind him, a new road unfolded ahead, slower, steadier, and illuminated by the pure light of human decency. As the late afternoon sun slid down the glass storefronts, casting golden rays across the newly polished sign, Ethan Carter stood before the store, quietly watching the fading light burst into a brilliant glow. He smiled, not the smile of a man pleased with profits, but the smile of someone who had endured hardship and pain to finally understand. But trust, if given blindly, will soon turn into cracks that are hard to mend. Trust must be nurtured every day, protected with vigilance, and preserved with a heart full of empathy. From afar, the sounds of cheerful voices echoed. Jake was helping an elderly gentleman load groceries into his car, while Julie calmly closed the financial records, her face serene and content. General Store had not only revived, it had matured, grown deeper and stronger than ever before. And in that moment, Ethan understood. No matter how many control systems you install, no matter how many surveillance cameras you set up, the most important thing a business must preserve is the light within the hearts of its people. The light on a storefront sign can be turned on with a switch, but the light in a person's heart must be kindled by integrity and kindness. Outcome. Ethan gently nodded, turning back toward the store where the doorbell chimed softly and warmly behind him, as if signaling the birth of a brand new beginning.